So our speaker for the evening is somebody that many of you will be familiar with from previous Humanist Association events. Professor David McConnell is the Humanist Association of Ireland's Honorary President. He's also one of the most popular speakers that we get. He always attracted a crowd when we used to present, or we used to host in Buswell's Hotel or in the Ashling as it was at the time. And now he's attracted the largest crowd we've had in a long time via Zoom. We've got 83 people here in the room today. So just a little bit about David, and there's an awful lot I could say, but I suppose the main bullet points, if you will, is that he's reasonably recently retired after a very distinguished academic career at Trinity College, where he was professor of genetics for 24 years. 2 years after his retirement, he was inaugurated as a Pro-Chancellor at Trinity. Now, that's a position that's really only reserved for the most distinguished graduates and academics, people who've made an exceptional contribution to the college. So there's probably not much more I could say about him to up the ante on that one, as regards the fact that he's one of, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, David, I think there are 6 Pro-Chancellors, but it's a very prestigious position. And anybody I speak to with any connection to that particular area of academia of genetics has got nothing but the highest praise for David as a person, as an academic and a lecturer. And we're really delighted that it wasn't just a case of going to David and asking him to do this. David very kindly volunteered to give this talk this evening. Such as his passion for the subject matter.
A nice picture from the US, protesters breaking into the Capitol, Trump protesters.
Yeah, come on.
You know.
This is yours.
Sorry, whoever.
Criminal.
Mute yourself there. Sorry about that. So just to say that, yeah, that the subject matter, as I think people know, is to examine the effect of Darwin's visit to the Galapagos Islands on his thinking and the role that visit played on the idea of evolution by natural selection. So without further ado, if people could give the traditional welcome, given the lack of audio that we have, for our speaker, David McConnell.
Well, thank you very much, Eamon. I hope you can hear me. People hear me? Good. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm just going to have to do a little reorganization here, I think. What do I do? There we are. Is that right? Or maybe this? How does that look, Eamon? Is that all right?
Yeah, we can see the slide perfectly, David.
And you see me up in the corner in case people want to make sure I'm really here? Yeah, okay. So, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all very much for taking time to listen and see some slides. I'm going to take you through some thoughts of my own about the relationship between Darwin and the islands of the Galapagos. And the simple reason for being interested in it is that Janet and I went there last December 2019. We spent 5 days. So this is now what's going on here. Hide. Don't seem to be able to. There we are. So I just wanted to say, of course, in passing, really, that Darwin is a very important figure to humanists. And I think that will become evident if people don't already know that. He really changed the way many people think about biology in general, of course, but the place of human beings in biology. He was born in 1809. He was independently wealthy. He never lifted a finger to make money in his life. He lived in a lovely house just south of London. In the countryside. He was devoted to his wife. She was devoted to him, and they had many children. He was, by all accounts, a truly wonderful and delightful person, very modest, and essentially taught interest. He did study some science at Cambridge, but not that much. He wrote a book in 1859 on the origin of species by natural selection, and that book changed the world. And it always puzzled me before I knew much about Darwin. I'm not a Darwin scholar, I want to emphasize. I'm simply interested in Darwin. It puzzled me, why did he use this title, On the Origin of Species? This is the book which tells us how evolution occurred, and it is indeed by natural selection. But what had it to do with the origin of species? So first of all, let's clear up what we normally think of as species. Members of the same species can interbreed. But members from different species do not interbreed naturally, or they only produce infertile offspring. For example, horses and donkeys can breed, but they produce mules or genets, which are sterile. And the very big question in Darwin's time was, do species change? And it was an enormously important question, because there were two competing, as it were, ideas. One was the notion of creation, that all species had been created once, and that was that, and did not change. Or alternatively, a relatively new idea in the modern period, that they did change, and they changed by a process called evolution. And Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a major proponent of the idea of evolution, as was Lamarck, the very great French biologist, who's much derided nowadays without people knowing very much about how fine a biologist he actually was. So the idea of evolution was there. And then came this extraordinary event. Darwin, aged 22, just out of Cambridge, was invited to join an expedition, a naval expedition, exploring the essentially the coast around South America, but other places as well, between 1831 and 1836, for 5 years. And we know that at the start of the voyage, he essentially believed in the idea of creation. He had conventional views. During the voyage, he began to doubt this, but by the end of the voyage, he was nearly, but not completely convinced that species evolve. So it was during this voyage, he came, as it were, to think seriously about whether species evolved. And in The Origin, which was published in 1859, a long time later, if you think about it, the Beagle was 1831 to 36. We're talking about 26 years later, 23 years later, that he wrote this book or published this book and proposed, excuse me, the idea of speciation and a mechanism. That was the key point, a mechanism. As I've said, the idea of evolution was not new, but Darwin's mechanism and the assembled evidence, he assembled evidence with great care and brilliance. His idea was that there was competition between individuals for survival and reproduction. The fittest survived. They were selected naturally, the idea of natural selection. And this, I think, is fairly commonplace in general knowledge. Many of you will be very familiar with these general ideas, but where did they come from? That's what I really want to explore tonight. Key to it all is variation. And look at our faces when we see ourselves all together. We're all different. And there's tremendous difference in not just people, but in every organism, more or less, that you look at. If you look at a stand of beech trees, or look carefully at butterflies of the same species, you will see variation within the species. This is the key point that he became really, really aware of. So what part did the Galapagos play? So we find him leaving England, 1831. They reached the Cape Verde Islands. That's the first landfall. He had made some very interesting observations there, which we won't bother going into. Then South America and the Falklands, and then a little over a month on the Galapagos in 1835. It's a long time into the voyage. And then he has some extraordinary notes that he makes all through the voyage, by the way, but in late October 1835, just left the Galapagos, we can see evidence of the way he was changing his ideas. and then further notebook entries, which I'll refer to in the next year or two, before and after, but just before and just after he reached home. Now, if you read The Origin, and I would encourage you all to read The Origin, it is a wonderful book, beautifully written. And by the way, almost all biologists have not read The Origin. I doubt it's on the curriculum of many universities. I don't think it's on the curriculum in Trinity. The word Galapagos appears on only 6 pages out of 388. There's no mention of finches, the famous Darwin's finches. There's no mention of the Galapagos tortoises or of the iguanas. There is a mention of the mockingbird on just 1 page, and that turns out to be a significant bird in his thinking. Ideas, if they were influenced by the Galapagos, you'd be, you know, if you read The Origin, you'd wonder, well, how big was that influence? Although there is evidence in The Origin if you read it carefully. So did the Galapagos matter? Well, he makes it absolutely clear, 1837, he's now back in England, and I'll read this to you. I'll read a few things on slides, just to make sure that, if you like, you have time to take in these ideas. And here he says, in 1837, he's now back in England, in July, opened first notebook on transmutation of species, that means evolution, had been greatly struck from about month of previous March in the character of South American fossils, which I'm not going to deal with, and species on the Galapagos archipelago. These facts, origin, that he means the origin, especially the latter, especially Galapagos, of all my views. So the Galapagos did matter. So how did it all start with Beagle's expedition? It was planned by Sir Francis Beaufort, who was really the first scientific officer of the Navy, an Irishman born in Navan. He planned the expedition. He chose Fitzroy to be the captain. Fitzroy said he wanted a companion with whom he could have some decent discussions on what was going to be a long voyage. The previous captain of the Beagle voyage had committed suicide, by the way. Beaufort talked to Peacock, who talked to Henslow, who was one of Darwin's teachers, and hence Darwin. And off they set. So here's the boat. It had a crew of 74. It was very small, 90 feet long. This is going through the Straits of Magellan. When we went to the Galapagos, we went on Nemo III, 75 feet, nearly as long as the Beagle, with 21 people on board. And we had a wonderful time. I'd encourage you all to do it. Darwin went around the world. We, unfortunately, hadn't either the time nor the money to do that. And here is his voyage. And I hope, can you see my arrow? Here we go, round Cape Verde, down the South American coast, round and up to the Galapagos and on. This is where they spent a lot of time going in and out of different places in South America. And notice that Darwin spent nearly 3 years of the 5 years on land. Everywhere you see a red arrow, Darwin landed. And he spent a lot of time. Young man, nevertheless, had the, if you like, the boldness to hire guides and mules or horses, and he rode miles, many, many miles into the interior of South America. When he landed here on the coast of Chile, he set off up one great valley, across the Andes by foot and mule, down into to Argentina and back across. Absolutely fantastic journeys, during which he saw and collected. He collected more than 1,500 specimens, which he preserved in alcohol, nearly 4,000 dried specimens, and he filled 2,000 pages of notebooks. This was a truly wonderful observationist and collector, and he was only in his early 20s, and he had very little experience or teaching. At the time, he was more of a geologist than a biologist, and this book, one of the greatest books in geology by Lyell, he read this, he took it with him on the trip. He got volumes 2 and 3 on the journey. The communication systems were good enough for that. And of course, Lyell's great contribution was to formalize, he wasn't the first to say it, but he was the person who really said the surface of the earth is changing. Furthermore, that the earth is very old. And Darwin said that this book was of the highest service to me. So here we are, the earth very old, changing slowly and steadily, including volcano, elevation, subsidence. And as Janet Brown, the Trinity graduate, the very, very great biographer of Darwin, who's now at Harvard, brilliant biography of Darwin in 2 volumes, really worthwhile reading, very easy to read. Without Lyell, there would have been no Darwin. So now we find him going up the west coast of South America and heading for the Galapagos. 700 miles off Ecuador. It's a large group of islands, about 10% altogether of the size of Ireland. Seen from space, very beautiful, I think. They're far enough apart that many of them cannot be seen from the others, and there are even 2 that don't even fit into this photograph. Here, volcano on the southwest corner, down here, you see the volcano. Here is Isabella, the biggest of the islands, with a huge volcano here, which is the Wolf volcano. And here it is specified 5,600 feet high. These are volcanic islands. Darwin spent, as I said, about a month traveling around. He only landed on 4 islands, and he didn't spend that much time on the islands. He spent about a week on one of them, moving around, camping. But he collected quite a number of specimens. That's the key thing. Notice that the islands are on the equator, but strangely enough, you don't feel that you're on the equator. It's not terribly hot. And by the way, the vegetation is not terribly remarkable either for the most part. When we went, we visited 5 of the islands. Only one of them really, well, 2 of them were in common with Darwin. But we did feel we were on Darwin's trail, which for a biologist is something really special. The islands, they're volcanic. The volcanoes are appearing in the northwest, up here in the northwest corner. The islands are forming. They're actually moving on the plates, on the great tectonic plates, and they're disappearing in the southeast here. The younger ones are 1 or a few million years old, and the older ones are 3 to 5 million years old. But this is a dynamic system. The islands are young. He knew they were young. He knew they were moving. And of course, they were obviously volcanic. When you see them, this is the kind of vista. You see the old volcanic cones. They're all over the place. The youngest one is Fernandino, 500,000 years old. And the oldest one, San Cristobal, 3.5 million years old. And others have been lost below the waves. By the way, Ireland moves too. But we started 500 million years down here in the South Atlantic. We crossed the equator, and today we're up here in the right-hand corner. So islands move, and the volcanic islands of the Galapagos are very young. That's a key point. There are 9 active volcanoes there today. There have been 24 eruptions in the last 50 years. And there's so much activity that the island of Fernandino has been covered with lava in the last 4,500 years. This is a very, very active system. There are cones, as we've talked about, there are great lava flows and boulder fields. Here are the boulder fields. They're fine for the iguanas. They're not so easy for people, but they are really lovely to walk across. I mean, quite challenging. You do need sticks, but you can do it. So those of you who are interested in this, glad to talk to you privately. It's something really worthwhile doing. Seals are very happy on these boulders, which is pretty extraordinary. There are seals everywhere. They're completely tame, as are many of the other animals on the islands. Beautiful, beautiful beaches. Water's cold, surprisingly. It's the Humboldt current coming all the way up from Antarctica. Janet and I were amongst a very small number of people who swam at all. It was lovely by Irish standards. So here's the problem. If the islands were new, How could the animals and plants be explained? And Darwin came quickly to the view that they had been colonized from South America. He noticed that the animals varied between the islands, so a particular species, or what I thought of as a species, they were different from island to island, and they were different from the mainland, but that didn't impress him very much at the time. And that is rather a key point in my interest in this, is how his ideas changed as he saw things and as he thought about things. And as Janet Brown says, he experienced no legendary moment of revelation on the Galapagos. There was no great experience as on the road to Damascus. The ideas formed slowly and steadily and ultimately reliably. But he collected. He was a great collector. He got 26 different kinds of land birds. And when he got home to London and gave them to the very great ornithologist Gould, Gould said there were 25 new species out of the 26. Today we know there are 60 resident species, of which 31 are endemic. In other words, only found on the Galapagos. There's been a huge eruption of new species on the Galapagos, and that's what he gradually came to realize, but didn't know it at the time. I have some photographs of the birds. This is the yellow warbler. It's an endemic, it's a subspecies, not a species. That's the modern decision. We'll talk more about how you decide about species in the modern world. This is the common moorhen. It's really common. It's exactly the same species, apparently, as the moorhen we have in Ireland. So why did the moorhen not, as it were, diversify on the Galapagos? There's a question, whereas other things did, as you will see. The Galapagos dove is not found anywhere else. It's obviously a very different kind of animal from any other dove. The Spieted heron, on the other hand, is an endemic subspecies. There are rather similar but slightly distinct herons on the South American mainland. There are frigate birds. These are visitors. They're found all over the place in various parts of the Pacific. Two species here, the magnificent and the great. Here are chicks. I was told that these were the magnificent frigate bird. Here is a frigate bird, male, displaying spectacular. Some of you may have seen these sorts of displays on David Attenborough, for example. This is the swallow-tailed gull. That's endemic. It's not found anywhere else except on the Galapagos. This is the Nazca Boogie, endemic, here photographed on Espanola. It's a kind of gannet, and you can sort of see that. If you know gannets, you'll understand. They behave like gannets. They look like gannets. This, on the other hand, is the blue-footed booby. It's a subspecies. There are very similar blue-footed boobies elsewhere, for example, on the South American mainland. This is the pelican. It's the same species of pelican in California, and as you find in the Baja Gulf of California, but it's only a subspecies. However, this spectacular bird, the waved albatross, that's endemic. They are huge and they are magnificent and they're more or less tame. Here, can you just see it? Is a chick of a waved albatross. Very well camouflaged. Camouflage looks a bit like a boulder, doesn't it? Here's one flying. Well, looks like a gull, doesn't it? Here is the Galapagos hawk flying. Hawks are big things. Here they are flying together. The hawk and the albatross are about the same distance away from me. The hawk is tiny, the albatross gigantic, magnificent to see. There are penguins there, the Galapagos penguin. It's the only penguin found in the Northern Hemisphere because it does go to parts of the Galapagos which are just north of the equator. And they're rather delightful, aren't they? The flamingos, on the other hand, are just the American flamingos, and there are very few freshwater lakes. This is one, and they are very, very beautiful, of course. You probably may not have, well, many of you may not have heard of mockingbirds, but these turn out to be rather dull creatures, but they were more important, as it turns out, to Darwin than anything that I've shown you so far. Here they are. And they're found there are many species found across South America. And Darwin knew about this because he had seen them. He'd seen them in Chile and he'd seen them in Argentina, and he knew about them being different species. He'd collected examples of them and so forth. Now he saw them on the Galapagos, as we did. They're really tame. There are lots of them. This turns out to be Mimus macdonaldii, now seen as a distinct species. It's only found in Hispaniola, and now seen as one of the 3 to 4 species on the island. They are quite happy to pick things off the backs of iguanas. Here are the specimens brought by Darwin. He wasn't, as I said earlier, he collected these things, but he wasn't that impressed when he was in the Galapagos. However, just after he left, this is late October 1835, this is his notebook. And let me read you this. He said, this bird is so closely allied to the finca, that's the mockingbirds of Chile, it's singular for existing, in other words, notable for existing as varieties or distinct species in the different islands. And this will come up again. Are they varieties or are they species? But he mentions the word species. And he says, I have 4 specimens from as many islands, but he believes these will be found to be 2 or 3 varieties, each variety constant in its own island, not separate species. And he notes that's similar to the tortoises, because it turns out that he discovered that the Spaniards, meaning the people who lived on the Galapagos, they can tell by looking at any of the giant tortoises which island they came from. In other words, very different tortoises, although all giant tortoises, they were different on the different islands. And he also remembered that in the Falkland Islands, there were 2 different kinds of foxes, one on the East Falkland and the other West Falkland, distinguishable. So he's looking at differences between similar organisms, but on different islands. Then he says, and I'm not sure, I hope you can see in the top corner of this, because mine is obscured for some reason. I don't know whether that makes it better. If there's the slightest foundation, he says, these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species. Now, this is only the second mention of his thinking about species in his notes while on the voyage. He's just coming to the view of that there's something special going. And he says, would undermine the stability of species. He realized this, he was stumbling, as it were, on something of very great importance. Now, I'm sorry, I've lost some things here. I don't know what I'll do here. That's the first thing. Okay, he gets back to London. He then brings the mockingbirds to Gould, and Gould tells him in 1837 that these comprise 4 different species. This is really quite, perhaps not a total shock to him, but he couldn't have said that. He was relying on Gould. And here is a diagram or a map showing that one of the species is common to a lot of the islands, but 3 of the species are restricted to single islands. And it was Gould here who made the big decision, not Darwin. What about the finches? Darwin collected, so did Fitzroy. Here are the finches. They're all over the place. They're little brown birds, rather uninteresting so far as I was concerned, but I knew they were the finches, so I photographed them. They are, you can just see one here on the rocks, well camouflaged. Here's one having a meal on an iguana. They're at the airport, a bit like pigeons flying out of certain kinds of airports. And they landed on the boat from time to time. There are lots of them. But would I have paid any attention to them? Probably not. And Darwin, no, I didn't really, except that I knew they were Darwin's finches, and they were important. So he's back in London. He's cataloguing and organizing his specimens, and he's not only sending his specimens to Gould, he's beginning to write his first well-known book, The Voyage of the Beagle, which is eventually published in 1839. The Finch specimens go to John Gould. Here are Darwin's sketches. He drew beautifully, I think you'll agree. And this diagram is in the origin. And these are four of the finches, and you can see they are pretty dramatically different. Look at the difference in the beaks. And Gould said they're different species. And these are now given various names by Gould. There's a lot of work being done on them since. And it's a big question about how many different species there are, which I'll tell you about. The beaks are adapted to different sources of food. This is the idea of diversification and adaptation to different ecological systems. So he imagined, and he had this clear idea emerging when he was on the Galapagos, that the finches came from South America, colonized and diversified. But he at the time was thinking about varieties, by the way, not of species, as I've said. So here are 12 of Darwin's finches. I'm not going to bother about the detail here, but the big question which remains today is how many different species are there? Now, at the same time that he was discussing this different number of species and so on, he was reading Thomas Malthus, and he says he read it in 1838. And here's a quotation from Malthus. This is the famous essay on the principle of population, that the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. Malthus was only talking about humans. Darwin, of course, saw it differently. Simple point, there are more offspring than parents, but food and shelter are limited, so many of the offspring probably die. That is a basic idea in Darwin's thinking, which essentially he got from Malthus, although he had ample evidence for it himself. Then came this. Now it looks like a scrap of paper, and that's exactly what it is. It's from his notebook B. It was written in 1837 or 1838, just after he got back. And I want you to look up in the top left-hand corner, I think. And then you see a biological tree, a tree. You also see letter A, B, C, and D. You see branches which come to an end. You see double branches coming to an end, but you see other branches which continue and continue to diversify. And you can see it here in a bit more detail. So this is what you might call the root of the tree or the stem of the tree, and here are the branches of the tree going up, leading to branches, but some branches seem to have ended. This, I believe, is one of the most important diagrams ever written in biology. And here I will now read a transcription of what's on the diagram. He says, I think case must be that one generation then, that's in the past, should be as many living now. In other words, there's no change basically in the numbers of the organisms. But to do this and have many species in the same genus, in other words, if you've gone from one species to many different related species, there must be extinction. And he was well used to the idea of extinction because he was very well aware of fossils. He had collected fossils, seen wonderful fossils in different places in South America. And then he says, thus, between A and B, here's A down here, bottom right, between A and B, he says, immense gap of relation. In other words, large difference in form. Between C and B, here they are, the finest degradation, and D rather greater. He had the idea that as you moved out on the branches of the tree, the organisms were more different. And this is I think, a really important diagram in the development of his thinking. About the same time, he's writing this wonderful question: what are the laws of life? Darwin isn't thinking about simple things. He's thinking about the great laws which must govern living systems. And he's only in his middle 20s. What are the laws of life, of which there was none at the time? And out of it come what I would say are the two fundamental laws of biology. due to Darwin, that organisms replicate, we know that, but they vary. Our offspring vary. Our offspring are similar to us, but they vary. And organisms evolve by natural selection. The fittest survive. And also, as Darwin well recognized, by simply chance events. You can have the islands of the Galapagos could be obliterated by a massive volcanic explosion, and all the species there would be eliminated. So chance plays a great role, and other kinds of chance which I won't go into. Darwin is responsible for these two great laws. They're not usually written in this form. I'm writing them in this way to encapsulate, as it were, what I believe were his greatest contributions. Now today, we say that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. You cannot make sense of anything in biology, including all human biology, and I mean all, unless you think about what's going on in terms of evolution, that the biological system has evolved. This particular statement is, I think, rather beautiful. It's very frequently quoted. It's from the great Russian-American geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky. So Darwin, in the Voyage of the Beagle, he had already decided, he had established all the great ideas in his mind, but he knew that these ideas were really, really revolutionary and were going to cause great disruption in society in general. But in the Voyage of the Beagle, published in 1839, he allowed himself to say this: hence, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth. He knew he was talking about an evolutionary system which went right back to the emergence of beings on this earth, which of course was going to be a very disruptive idea. Now, what did he do with his ideas to make sure that they would be ultimately published? So in 1842, he wrote a brief sketch, only 35 pages, scribbled, garbled. That's Janet Brown's phrase. And he included in it some of his greatest ideas he had written down in one short essay, however chaotic. And all the ideas, which were later to appear in the Origin, are in that essay. And even at the beginning of the essay, he actually outlines the chapters that he's going to have in the great book that he is about to write, which he wants to write, and at some stage will dare to publish. But he didn't dare publish. And in 1844, he published what is described as a full essay on evolution, privately, very carefully copied, and a letter to his wife, who, by the way, never lost her religious faith. And nevertheless, he was going to rely on her to have this published. And it says, in case of my sudden death, you will devote £400 to its publication. If he died, he wanted people to know what his ideas were. Then came, of course, the great book, 1859. And I just want you to look up here in the top left-hand corner, Variation under Domestication. This is the first chapter in this great book, is actually about domesticated animals, not about animals in nature. He then goes on to variation in nature, struggle for existence, and so on and so forth, and all the great chapters of this book, including geographical isolation distribution, which really focuses on the islands and the Galapagos. It doesn't talk much about the Galapagos specifically, but it does talk about them. It's so well worthwhile reading. I just love you to think, if you do nothing else after you've listened to this evening, please buy The Origin and read it. And the first bit of the first chapter is about pigeons, about domesticated pigeons. And here are some domesticated pigeons. And of course, pigeon fanciers, people today, collect strange and beautiful looking pigeons and breed them. So did he. And he was a member of the local pigeon fanciers club. he knew a lot about pigeons. And he knew that all those domesticated pigeons are actually domesticated forms of something called the rock pigeon. And the rock pigeon is found around Ireland, as I understand it. Yes, you can see it there. You find it on the seashore around here. I've seen it, I believe. I'm not a very good bird person, but I believe that I have seen it flying around here. But all of those pigeons are variations on this pigeon. He also realized that dogs are domesticated dogs, so many different varieties. I'll show you a picture in a minute. He knew that he guessed correctly. Of course, it was obvious to him once he'd got these ideas that they had been domesticated wolves. He says Canidae could have been other species of wild dog, but this is him writing now in The Origin of Species. And we now know that wolves were domesticated somewhere between 14 and 100,000 years ago. This is the work of a guy called Bob Wayne. There are 400 defined breeds of dog recognized by the World Canine Organization. They are all wolves. There is fantastic genetic variation in the domesticated dogs, but all that genetic variation has its origin in wild dogs, wolves. In the origin, there is one diagram. This is it. It's not very clear, by the way, in the facsimile editions of the origin, but it's a tree. And if you go down here to the bottom left-hand corner, you imagine an organism A. It diversifies along two branches. So out here, the organisms are getting different from here. They differ at each point for the branch, and a lot go extinct, but the branches continue. They branch again and again. Most of the organisms go extinct. But you end up with, having started with A, you end up with a bunch of different organisms. Many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years later. Darwin didn't put timescales on these things. He just knew it was a very long time. So let's look briefly at what we know today. So let's look at the finches. And I'm interested in this because the early work was done by a brilliant student of mine, Colm O'Higgins. After he left Trinity, he went to do his so-called postdoctoral work with a man called Jan Klein and became a brilliant evolutionary geneticist. He studied the DNA in Darwin's finches. So he got DNA, that is the genetic material, from 28 mainland finches and 13 of Darwin's finches. And remember that the DNA is a kind of code. And if you compare the DNA from one organism and other organisms, you can compare the DNA and you can find out how similar the DNA is from the different organisms. So here's a tree. I hope you're not put off by this, but imagine the root of the tree, the stem of the tree is on the left. And out here you have the names of all the different finches that Colm worked on. And most of these finches are from South America. Each name here is a finch, and it's at the end of a branch. If you have two very close together, it means that the DNA from this finch is very similar to the DNA from that finch. A little bit more different from that finch's DNA and more from that. So you can put them on a tree, and you can also measure how similar they are, and that gives you the length of branches. So you have a tree, a giant tree with all the finches on the ends of the branches. This group here, these are 5 of Darwin's finches. And you see they all group together. So they're more similar to each other than they are to any of the other finches, as if they all arrived on the island, are all derived from one ancestral group arriving on the islands. It also shows you here that this thing called Tiaris obscura is the mainland finch, which is most closely related to Darwin's finches. So to cut a long story short, and just to summarize, Darwin's finches, according to Colm, form a single group. All are closely related to each other. It implies they all originated from one mainland species. And the evidence from Colm was that it's something called Tiaris obscura. How many species of Darwin's finches are there? That's a hot topic. Maybe only 5. Maybe only the ground finches, a thing called the coatless finch, the tree finch, vegetarian finch, and the warbler finch. However, within the people who study this kind of thing, there are people called lumpers and other people called splitters. The lumpers want to combine 2 or more species into one. The splitters tend to separate one species into 2 or more. So some more recent work by Farrington et al., it's 14 years later, their drawing, their evidence, they say, gives them 16 species. Personally, I think that's for the birds. I think these are much more likely to be varieties. I think Cullen is closer to it. But what you are seeing is something really important, and that is the idea, not so much that there are as to the number of species, but the process of speciation. These, over time, over millions of years, from a single, as it were, invasion of the islands by one of the mainland finches, many finches of different forms appeared, diversified, using by adapting and being selected. However, let's not be too hard on the splitters. Recently, people observed something called, what they now call the vampire ground finch. It's found on 2 islands of Wolf and Darwin, which are rather far away and they're very small. There's not very much water on these islands, and it has been found that this fish, which is a kind of ground finch, actually sucks blood from live Nazca boobies, and the boobies don't mind. And this is the only group of finches which have this particular behavior. Are they a separate species because they have this particular behavior? Well, Farrington says so, because here it is, this thing, septentrionalis, that's the vampire finch. Well, it illustrates the difficulties that the biologists have in deciding how many species there are, but it really does show you, as it were, speciation, the process of speciation happening. Tortoises, we saw them on the island of Santa Cruz. There are 3,000 on the island. They're highly protected. There are special ponds dug for them. They're completely tame. And they're rather attractive. And the question is, are they really different from each other on different islands? Well, yes, they are. I'm not going to bother you with the data, but the different tortoises can be distinguished by their DNA. And furthermore, you can show that they're related to tortoises on the mainland. And this group, Cacconi et al., they have some theories as to which of the tortoises on the mainland is the closest to the tortoises on the Galapagos, all of which are very close to each other by comparison to those on the South American continent. Marine iguanas, they're everywhere. They're completely fearless. They're revolting looking creatures, unless you're another iguana, I suspect. They come in the marine form. They like to keep warm. And then there are the land iguanas, which don't go to sea. The marine iguanas, they are vegetarians and they eat seaweed, particular kinds of seaweed in the sea. They dive in and dive down and chew on it on the bottom. The land iguanas also vegetarians, and they eat vegetable matter on land. Now let's see, how many species of iguana can you guess? Well, it looks like the land iguana is very different from the marine iguana, and it is. Recently, a new form of iguana was discovered called rosada, and it was discovered on that volcano. And photographs B and C here show it. It's pink. They call it rosada, in other words, pink. Here's the more usual yellow form here and here. And typically for modern biologists, they got DNA from all of these, compared the DNA, and produced a tree. So here we have all the land forms. They all form a group. And here are all the marine forms from different islands. Now, looks like there are slight differences between the different forms from the different islands. but nobody went so far as to say they're different species. Down here, the new form rosada is given the name marthi, and it's really very different from all the other land iguanas, which, depending on which island they come from, are a bit different from each other. But you can see that from the terminology, they're all a bit confusing. So you take your choice, are these all the same species, or maybe there's one or two species here? I think it's a matter of convention, actually. But this one is clearly a good deal more different from any of the others, and they're all more different. These land ones are really different than the marine ones. However, this is a hybrid iguana. An iguana which is the result of a mating between a male marine iguana and a female land iguana. And they are found on, they have been found on a particular island. And it happened that there was an El Nino event. There was great, the seaweeds disappeared, the marine iguanas then began to forage on land, and they met the female land iguanas and hybridized. It's believed, I haven't been able to confirm it, that these are sterile. This is like a horse and a donkey mating, giving rise to a mule. So you can see again the process of speciation happening. I'll briefly say something about plants. Darwin and others collected lots of plants. There's fantastic number of plants, a huge number of plants on the Galapagos, of which many are new species. So of the 175 that Darwin collected, 100 were identified by Hooker, the great director of Kew, as new species. Here is one of the prickly pears. There are 6 endemic species of prickly pear. There's a genus called Scalicia. There are daisies. 15 species are found on the Galapagos, nowhere else. They're called the Darwin's finches of the plant world. Some of them are pretty big. These are daisies now, and they're 20 meters high, and does look a little bit like a tropical forest, doesn't it? But most of the islands don't have anything like this kind of rich vegetation. So in summary, organisms replicate with variation. Variations are inherited. Darwin didn't know why and made a bags of all that. Doesn't matter. Geneticists worked that out later in the 20th century. The competition for survival and reproduction. Some variants succeed. Survival of the fittest. The role of chance I've mentioned. As variants diverge, some become reproductively isolated. That's speciation. Some species go extinct. In fact, most do. Others survive and continue to diversify. Now, finally, the origin. This is the first sentence. I'll read it for a couple of reasons. One is Darwin writes beautifully. He really wrote beautifully. Many years ago, when comparing and seeing others compare, that's Gould and so on, the birds from the separate islands of the Galapagos archipelago, both one with another, and with those from the American mainland, I was much struck how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties. And we've discussed that. It's to some degree arbitrary, but speciation does occur. Of course it does. And he mentions the Galapagos there in that very first sentence. The last sentence. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I hope you love that, or will come to appreciate that splendid sentence, this grandeur of the view of life that comes from the discovery of the theory of evolution. And he said once in the origin, only once, he said something about man. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and on his history, and hers too, of course. That's Darwin's dangerous idea. We have evolved, of course, and we are continuing to evolve, though very slowly, from our own personal points of view, thank goodness. This statement is from John Dewey, the great American philosopher. He argues that the origin of species changed everything about the way we should change everything, I would say, about the way we think. He calls it the greatest precipitant of new methods, new intentions, new problems. He sees the origin of the species as the climax of the scientific revolution. He wrote a brilliant essay on it from my point of view, but nevertheless, he sees that this must change. He's writing in 1909, by the way. This must change the way philosophers think, and indeed, more or less every other scholar who thinks seriously about the world around us. Well, that passed the time. Some of you know, however, there is another sentence. It would have passed in any case. And another. Yes, but not so rapidly. And that, of course, is from Waiting for Godot. Thank you all, and stay safe.
David, thanks so much. That was, I think, a fantastic overview of the evolution, no pun intended, of the idea, where it came from, and as well the importance of the idea, but as well what I think what shone through there is your passion for it as well, and for Darwin, which always does. Every year we hear you speak at the Darwin Day lecture as well, and your passion for the man and his work is evident for all to see. I think what I think I'll do is give you a few moments to catch your breath, because you've been speaking for almost an hour. I think now might be a good time to just give Janie another opportunity to remind people about the event taking place next week, and a couple of other announcements as well about the forthcoming Darwin Day lecture and one or two other things, and then we'll open the floor to a few questions, if that's okay with you.
That's fine. Should I stop sharing at this point?
That might be a good idea. Then we can see more people on the screen. Take it away, Janie.
Okay, Eamon, thank you. David, I just want to say I don't know so much about Darwin writing beautifully, but it's you put so much into the spoken word that it just transports. It certainly has transported me into a completely different world of all of the different species that you've shown there. So thank you. It's fascinating to watch. It really is. Just like I suppose the evolution of species and how they change, I suppose attitudes in Ireland change. And really that's where we're at the moment with the situation over the proposed changing legislation with Dying with Dignity. And there's been a group of us who came together, just a reminder, it's called End of Life. You can find us on social media. And we're hosting next week on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, a meeting where what we want to do is place in context the current legislation and the proposed legislation in the bill, and a summary of the submission that the research team on End of Life have been preparing. So I'd encourage you all to join if you can, and you can find us on social media, register with us there, either through the Facebook link or email info@endofireland.ie. Is that right? Mairead, somebody tell me. I've written it so many times that you tend to forget. To ask to be put on the list, which obviously keeps us GDPR compliant as well. But we'd love you to join us on the night. And obviously then what we can do is invite people who want to be involved to put their skills to great use. And then we'll see more change. David, once again, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much, Janie. Just two things to announce before we take the questions. And I see that Alan Tuffery has found the mechanical raising a hand function. So he'll get the first one. He can maybe explain to other people where that is as well. But just in relation to Darwin, our annual Darwin Day lecture will take place next month. Usually it takes place on the 12th, which is Darwin's birthday, but that's a Friday this year. So we think we might get a better attendance if we were to have it on the Thursday. So Thursday, the 11th. And of course, given the times we're living in, it will be virtually over Zoom. This year's lecture, we're delighted to have Professor Aoife Mcleisich. She's head of genetics department at Trinity College and is actually a former student of David's as well. She will discuss Darwin's Descent of Man. It's 150 years since the publication of that book, and she's going to examine how that work holds up in the light of today's knowledge of genetics and human evolution. So that's Thursday, the 11th of February at 7:30. So more information will go up on the website and on Facebook and places about that soon. And just one other thing to announce before we hand over to Alan to ask the first question is that many of you will know Joe Armstrong. He's a humanist or HEI celebrant. He's also a journalist, and he has recently published his memoir, which is called In My Gut, I Don't Believe. In it, he discusses his journey from being a seminarian with the Marists to being a non-believer and a humanist celebrant. And many of you will have read some of the excerpts from this. It's sort of been serialized in the Irish Freethinker magazine over the last 2 to 3 years. I've got my copy. It's I've based purely on the magazine extracts. I think it's going to be an excellent read. I'm one chapter into it so far, very good. And this is available on Amazon. Joe Armstrong, In My Gut, I Don't Believe. So there's a quote on the back from Professor A.C. Grayling, of all people, saying it's a fascinating, courageous and moving account of an individual leaving the trammels of religion for the good light of humanism. So there you go. And there's few people that such praise would be more worthy than coming from A.C. Grayling. So Dara, or beg your pardon, Alan, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask the first question, and maybe you can explain to people as well where they can find the function to raise their hand as well.
Yeah, right. Well, the function, I found it under More, but I'm using an iPad, a cheap iPad. So it's under More, and there's a raise hand function in amongst those things somewhere. David, I'm not given to great praise, but while I was listening to you, rapt, I might say, I share your admiration for Darwin and his prose, and I'm fussy about my prose. The word magisterial came to mind. That was a magisterial performance, and I thank you very much for it. I can't remember when I quite had so much pleasure in an hour's viewing on Zoom, which is normally very hard work. That was terrific. Can I just say that Darwin's ideas and the idea of evolution, and Dobzhansky says, it's the only way to make sense of things, was the gist of his quotation. There is, for us who are humanists, the great work of putting Darwin's ideas and the idea of evolution into the center of our world was done by Julian Huxley, not very well known nowadays. He was the first director of UNESCO, so he was a big wheel in his time. He was, I think, the first president of Humanist UK, as it might not have even been, well, certainly wasn't called that then. British Humanist Association, it might have been called back in those far off days. I think his Essays of a Humanist is available online as a pirated PDF. It's long since out of copyright. It's published in the early 60s, I think. I thoroughly commend Huxley's Essays of a Humanist to you. And it is a thoroughly worked piece of how evolution applies to every aspect of human cultural existence. I don't like some of the things he says, and he's kind of stuck in an earlier time frame, and the ladies will not like his pronouns. I'm sorry about that, but he's brought up in the 30s and 20s and 30s, so he uses the masculine pronoun very exclusively. So thank you very much. Thank you, David. That was just terrific.
You're very, very kind, Alan. By the way, just to say that, of course, Huxley was tremendously important. What's interesting about it is that we're talking about a person who held this wonderful position in UNESCO after the war. It's very late. And it took a very long time for, even amongst scientists, broadly speaking, to accept Darwin's ideas. And part of the reason for that was that there wasn't a good theory of genetics. And that was sorted out in the early 20th century, especially by people like Fisher and Sewell Wright and so on. Fisher wrote a book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. So it took a long time, and that was wasn't easy to read, by the way. So it's in a way, it's really quite surprising how long it was, even amongst the scientific mainstream, for the theory of evolution of natural selection to become mainstream.
Thanks very much,
Okay.
David.
Do you want me?
Dara, you are next, and just as well to say, I have a note here in the chat box from Mihai Todor, who said that if you click on participants, and then the raise hand button will show up on the right hand bar. So that's where you'd go for that. Dara, we'll take your question, and then Mihai.
David, hi. A question. In fact, I've mentioned this to Alan in the past, and it is, I'm a layman, not a scientist, but is there a comparison to be made between the way the virus mutated in the last year, for instance, and the way species mutate over millennia, maybe very long term? Are they the same process, just speeded up, or are they totally separate?
I was really hoping somebody would ask that question. I can tell you, Darwin would have sat and watched the COVID pandemic with enormous scientific pleasure. He would have been horrified, of course, he's a very humane man, but it is evolution happening in front of our eyes. It's absolutely, it's an extraordinary experiment, a natural experiment in evolution. I was thinking how to say it. That virus lived on an island called Batland. It was actually a bat virus. And it hopped into man or woman, and it probably kept its head down for quite a long time. Nobody probably noticed it. We don't quite know what was going on, but it acquired then the capacity to be transmitted between people. And we now see it transmitting. And now that finch from the mainland has landed on the Galapagos, human land, and is ripping through human land. And it has found in human land not a bare, barren bunch of volcanic islands, but a lush, uninhabited, equatorial habitat. And it's having a whale of a time, and it is mutating. And the mutations that count are those which allow it to transmit more rapidly.
Yes.
Those are fitter, faster viruses. It's vintage Darwinism.
Evolution.
Perfect Darwinism.
Listen, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Eamon.
You want to fire ahead, Mihai?
Okay, so thank you, David, for the very nice talk. That was quite interesting and fascinating. I just wanted to say, like, as a follow-up, like a complementary material, somebody created about 10 years ago this project, and it's the evolutionary edition of Darwin's Origin of Species. So I'm not sure if the book is still available. I just found the idea very fascinating because the book has changed over the years, and this person put together all these editions, and you can like turn pages in the book and see how it evolved through time. So I found that very nice. I put a link in the chat.
Yeah, that's a lovely story. Of course, he was. I mentioned how nervous he was because, you know, he was a conservative man, and he loved the society in which he lived, and he didn't want to disturb people's profound beliefs. And yet, there's no question about it. He believed, as he said, that life started in a little hot pond, and molecules were running into each other, what we now call prebiotic evolution. He had an incredible vision, and he knew this must disturb the deep feelings which were shared of, you know, of his wife and almost everybody in Britain, and indeed in the Western world, would have held these views, and he was really disturbing these views. And in the subsequent editions, there are places where he moderated his views, as I understand it, to make them less sharp, if you would. But he himself, his own personal views never changed. He was a confirmed, dare I say it? I can. He was a confirmed humanist. Thank you.
You're on.
Thank you, Eamon. Sorry, just unmuting there. I'd like to also just thank David for his time. Really excellent and interesting presentation. I just wanted to know, firstly, David, did you manage to see the new Attenborough series, Perfect Planet, on Sunday on BBC One?
I saw bits of it, yeah. And may I make a suggestion? I think David Attenborough has contributed so much to the feeling that we all share this planet. And that is a contribution to peace. And I think he should receive the Nobel Peace Prize. I've never seen it written. Maybe some of you have. And I don't know how to, I know you can't propose somebody unless you are a former Nobel winner. But I think his contributions have been quite extraordinary, bringing us all together, every single person on the planet. Absolutely. Must have learned so much from him. Such a great teacher he is. And look at his record, how many decades.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And the reason I mentioned him, David, was I noticed in your presentation you included reference to the vampire finch and the Nazca Boogie.
Yes, that was on it.
Yeah,
yes.
And it struck me immediately that relationship, I love symbiotic relationships in nature, which I've learned through natural history documentaries. But that relationship, the fact that the boobies were so comfortable with the finches had clearly built up a relationship over millennia, where they would have been providing a service of taking the parasites and the mites and the ticks and the bugs off the boobies. And then at some point, after being very efficient in exterminating all the bugs, became the parasite itself in the end.
Yes. Biology is wonderful, you see, isn't it?
It certainly is
fascinating. Wonder, I mean wonder, real wonder, yes. Thank you.
Ian Graham, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. It's great. I loved it. This is a slightly more philosophical question. Would you speculate a little bit on the parallels between the evolution of species and the evolution of scientific thought in the scientific community?
That's a lovely. Is it too late at night? I don't know for that. All right. Thought evolves, for sure. And thoughts that are ideas that are found useful, of course, persist. So there's a kind of social selection of ideas. One could apply the same idea, say, to music. I mean, there's a great amount of music which is composed. All of it survives. It's all written. It's there. But some of it just disappears from the from being played, just isn't played. Sometimes music is recovered, and so yeah.
Let's hope that it's still the survival of scientific ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and scientific ideas, of course. I mean, if we think of some of the ideas which were turned out not to be correct. So, for example, Lamarck's idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics is almost certainly entirely wrong, although maybe correct in some very special cases. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that Lamarck was not a very, very great biologist, as I said. Yeah, I mean, there were great ideas during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, indeed up to 1945, 1950, that genes were made of protein. By the way, there was not a single jot of evidence for this idea, but it completely dominated everybody's thinking. And the most powerful figures in the field put forward this idea, and others didn't even bother to think about it until one or two people got to work and pointed out, or actually carried out experiments which showed genes are not made of proteins, they're made of DNA. Yeah, and there's a tendency to write off those people who said genes were proteins. We shouldn't do that. Some of them were absolutely outstanding and brilliant scientists who made brilliant contributions. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
You're right. You're on the right track. We are. But by the way, I think the theory of evolution, just in passing, it applies actually to every changing system. So I would say it applies, for example, to the evolution of planets, the evolution of solar systems. These things change. Some of them survive, some of them go extinct. So there is selection for survival, as it were. So this is, I think, what Dewey was saying, you know, that this notion of change, this incredible importance of change, that's a fundamental idea which Darwin, that idea now is thought of by chemists and physicists, and of course it always was. Indeed, very early on it was thought of by geologists and social philosophers, whatever it should do. Yeah. Thank you, Ian.
Thank
you. Brian McClinton.
Thank you very much, David, for that fascinating talk. I'm not a scientist. I'm more a kind of amateur philosopher, I suppose. A bit of a historian as well, a bit of a jack of all trades.
It's better than that, Brian.
But what often interests me about people who have come out with great ideas, Kant is another example, where the ideas are distorted. And because, of course, this phrase natural selection was a phrase that Darwin used, and then, of course, Herbert Spencer interpreted that as survival of the fittest, Darwin's ideas, of course, were distorted by social Darwinists. Of course, it took survival of the fittest to mean survival of the most physically strong, the most aggressive, and so on, with disastrous results, of course, in some countries. Isn't that an awful tragedy in a way that how indeed can we avoid this kind of misinterpretation of great thinkers and great scientists, which so often happens? That's a very good question.
You know, Brian, one of the crosses that we have to bear as evolutionary biologists or geneticists is the terrible misuse to which some of these ideas have been put, of course, culminating in Nazism and in certain varieties, so certain serious distortions of eugenics. Now, the crucial thing that we need to recognize is this. Natural selection has been superseded, and natural evolution has been superseded because of the emergence of human cultures, the evolution of human culture. So we are now seeing enormously rapid cultural evolution. Cultural evolution has put biological evolution in the shade. So occasionally we are surprised, of course, by the biological evolution. The coronavirus is an example. But by and large, the changes that we've seen over the last 10 to 20,000 years have been precipitated and driven by cultural evolution, cultural pressures, cultural selections. And it is, of course, a matter of choice as to how we organize our cultures, how we organize our societies, and whether or not we adopt what all of us here, I think, would say are civilized, humane values, and never allow the distortion of, or the transmission, as it were, of things like survival of the fittest as an excuse to permit grotesque experiments, if you like, in social development. You're right. It's a horrid thing, and it makes it very difficult for me, by the way. I mean, there are a lot of things I'd like to say sometimes in public about how to use genetical knowledge to benefit people. But I know that as soon as I begin to make these arguments or take part in these discussions, I can see that people misinterpret what I'm trying to do, whereas all I'm trying to do is give people the opportunity to lead happier, more contented and better lives. Yeah.
Do you not think, though, David, to some extent, scientists themselves are to blame because they didn't, in the past, adequately explain what survival of the fittest meant and what Darwin meant by it? You know, that it could mean survival of the most cooperative, it could mean survival of the most selfless, and so on, rather than just what these other people were interpreting it as. Or am I just imagining that they didn't actually try to explain
I
the meaning of the term, you know.
I think there are faults on both sides. I think we need to make an effort on both sides. Scientists need to make a bigger effort to explain, but I think humanists, I mean, students of the humanities like yourself, a gifted writer, may I say, I think we would like you to make a bigger effort. To engage with us, participate in understanding. So we need to do much more on both sides. There's no question about it. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
But it's not. I do protest, if I may. I don't think the fault is only on one side.
We're going to have just two more questions from the first women of the night to ask questions as well. We'll take Bridget Carlin first of all, and then Jennifer Sturgeon, if you can ask yours. Bridget, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, it's not so much a question as something I'd like your thoughts on. Well, actually, I've got two things, and one is very silly, I think, but I'm going to throw it in at the end because I want to know. But I'm very interested. The last time you did a talk, I can't remember when it was, you were again extolling us to buy The Origin of the Species, and I did. Got a look, big copy.
Well done, Bridget, brilliant.
Yes. Now, then, of course, I fall down because I've hardly read any of it. I dip in and out occasionally. It's awful big and lumpy. But the fact that he started off with domestic animals, and I'm thinking on climate change here, and just how cows, I should say, are surely must be seen as one of the most successful animals because there are so very, very many of them in the world today, but because of our intervention. And of course, it's cattle with forest devastation and methane that are contributing so greatly to the greenhouse gases that are destroying the world for everybody. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. And then my second question is, and it was prompted by your photo of the myriad faces there at the beginning. I can remember hearing forever ago that no two zebras have the same pattern of stripes. Is that pure nonsense or is there some truth in it?
Well, Bridget, first of all, I'm not an expert on zebras, but I think you're probably right. Yeah, and likewise, I mean, I think if you looked at, say, tortoiseshell butterflies, I think you would find no two tortoiseshell butterflies have the same pattern on the wings at the level of detail, right? Yeah, for sure. And I would guess even that identical twin, I'm sure they do exist, zebras probably have slightly different patterns on their backs, as identical twin people are not actually identical. They're very similar. So otherwise, the breeding of, or at least the domestication of cattle and so on, has it done damage? Well, of course it has, or is now. Was it doing damage when our population was 3 billion or 2 billion? No. So the whole thing has just gone to excess. I mean, our own population is actually, I mean, the most serious thing of all is that we are now heading towards 9 billion. It's our own fault. We are ourselves becoming too numerous. And some of the things that we have domesticated, some of the animals like cattle, yeah, they are too numerous. But we have a choice in all of these matters. And it's now a matter to listen to the young people and change the way we do things, for sure.
And is it because of the devastation of the forest and the environment that the bat virus did?
No, no, you can't say that. What is happening, however, sorry to interrupt you, what is happening is, and this has gone back, by the way, thousands of years, people have begun to associate with animals in a way that they never, when they were hunter-gatherers, they didn't associate with animals. As soon as we became real farmers and domesticated species, we began to receive their bacteria and their viruses. So TB, human TB, came from cattle. Flu comes from poultry mostly, but also from swine. So as soon as humans are in very close proximity to animals, the process of domestication, going back so long, that's 10,000 years approximately, that has caused bacteria and viruses, not caused, it has allowed bacteria and viruses to jump from animal species into humans, the so-called zoonotic infections. You're absolutely right. It's a consequence of being farmers, but it goes back a long way. It's nothing to do with jet. I mean, jet travel and so on increases the transmission rate, but it's the actual huge numbers of people living in close proximity to animals, which is causing this.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Dave.
Thank
And
you.
for the final
And
question.
by the way, thank you. Can I just say thank you for your talk? I think you are such an eloquent speaker. Beautiful. Thank you.
You're obviously talking to me, Bridget, right?
Sweetheart, you just need a little bit more practice.
Thanks. And for the last question of the evening, Jennifer Sturgeon, do you want to unmute?
Did I miss you, Jonathan?
Oh, and yeah, I suppose Jonathan Mason actually as well.
Hi, thank you, David. That was a wonderful talk and I loved all the illustrations. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think are human beings interfering with the process of evolution? Are we making a big impact, or is it just a tiny, are we just scratching the surface? I'm thinking of, genetic modification of crops. I'm thinking of maybe artificially producing babies. Are we having a big impact on evolution, or is it just, are we just scratching the surface?
We've completely changed the course of evolution. First of all, by the emergence of agriculture. Agriculture is the single largest, has had the single largest effect on the planet. The emergence of agriculture, primitive agriculture, which became more sophisticated. And GM is just a slight variation on that. It's not a very significant variation on the scale of things. Medical, the invention of medicine, real medicine, not the quack medicine of the early years of hundreds of years ago, but modern medicine has completely changed the course of evolution. So simply put, I mean, I'm wearing glasses. I mean, a few hundred years ago, I wouldn't have survived. And, I have 2 metal knees. I'd be dead by now. Diabetics would not have survived. So we've really changed. We've eliminated so many causes of death and disability. However, let me give you another example just in passing. I mean, most infectious diseases have no, we've eliminated so many of them. Smallpox is gone. Polio is nearly gone. My aunt died of diphtheria. Who else has an aunt who died of diphtheria? Some of you may have, but it's impossible to imagine it happening now. So we have changed the course of evolution totally. That's really partly what I mentioned, that cultural evolution is now in charge by far, far more influential. Genes are taking a back seat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Jonathan, we'll give you the honor of the last question of the evening.
David, obviously eugenics has been the dark side of how Darwin's ideas have been taken up, and they've been so very pervasive. But do you think that the role of collaborations in evolution need to be emphasized more than the competition and the idea the idea that evolution is selection by competition, and the stronger getting rid of the weaker, whereas a cow cannot digest grass. Bacteria can digest grass, so the cow has the appropriate bacteria in its rumen, or we ourselves can be regarded as a biome rather than an individual organism, because there's all sorts of things. We've got more cells of organisms that are not part of our DNA in our bodies than the cells of our bodies themselves. Can you speak on that for a minute?
Well, I mean, I think it's a lovely question. The first thing I would do is recommend everybody to read E.O. Wilson, The Social Conquest of the Earth. E.O. Wilson is now in his 90s. He's written 30 or 40 books. He's won, 10 Pulitzer Prizes. He is by the way, going back to Brian Clinton earlier, he is a zoologist. And he's one of the greatest communicators, a beautiful writer. In any case, Social Conquest of the Earth, what he argues is this, that the most successful creatures on the planet are those which have the most highly developed social systems. And we, that is human beings, have a hugely successful, highly developed social system. Many insects do too. So he gives you the figures and what percentage of biomass on the planet is composed of social insects. It's a huge percentage. So in any case, he then goes on to argue, which I think is true, although we don't have the kind of evidence I'd love to have, that man is genetically programmed, predisposed to be social. We're not just social because we've got used to being social, we're social because we have a genetic predisposition to it. And we, in his mind, as he said, what's his expression? He says we're part saint, part soldier. That within our genetic makeup, there's this extraordinary dichotomy of competitiveness. He argues that we are genetically competitive. I think that's probably true. And he also argues that we are genetically cooperative, and that within society, if you look at the composition of societies, you will see people who are, he would say, partly genetically competitive, being successful, but you will also see people who are genetically predisposed to be cooperative, also being successful. And he argues, I think, I haven't read it for some time, but that the most successful human societies are those where you have the right balance between competitiveness and cooperativeness. You have it in individuals. I mean, people are both cooperative and competitive, but you have some people who are more competitive, and in society they achieve apparently more, but you have others who are cooperative and they achieve a lot. So it's a delightful exposition by a very, very serious behavioral biologist. He wrote a famous book which caused a huge amount of problem, Sociobiology. You can have a look at it, published in the 60s, I think, if not, yeah, late 60s, early 70s. He was maligned for it. But E.O. Wilson, I think, will turn out to be one of the most influential biologists in this general area. And that's leaving aside what you're mentioning, and that is, of course, the importance of the idea of an ecosystem, that we live with other organisms. So cooperation is a really, really important idea in biology. Of course it is. But what fascinates me about E.O. Wilson is that he's hypothesizing that within the human genome, there are genes for being cooperative, none of which we know anything about.
Thanks, David. I think that's a great note to finish on. I suppose
Thanks,
it just remains for me to say thank everybody for coming. I've no doubt you enjoyed it, and many of you will have enjoyed it as much as I did. Absolutely fantastic and fantastic and fascinating talk, David, and we owe you a great deal of gratitude for that. And we're looking forward to hearing you speak ahead of the Darwin Day lecture again in a few weeks' time. Just to remind people to check out the details on humanism.ie and on Facebook for details on the Darwin Day lecture, but it'll be Thursday, February the 11th. And David has agreed to give the opening address, as he's done every year for the last few years. I think it says a lot about the esteem you're held in the organization, David, that 100 people came to the talk and there were still 93 here after an hour. And more than 2/3 stuck around for the Q&A as well. So that's the biggest attendance we've had for these in almost a year.
I wish my students had been like that.
I think I speak for everyone when I say really appreciate you giving up your time this evening to do that, and it'd be great if we could give David a final round of applause and gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you all again very soon, I'm sure.
Good night, everybody.